Welcome to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries, where we explore how we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in our modern context. Here is your host, pastor and evangelist, Kevin Henry.
Welcome back to the Gospel Activist Podcast. Today in the program, we're going to be discussing the Bible and mythology. Are there similarities? Are there differences? When someone makes that claim that the Bible is just mythology, how should we respond? We're going to look at that in a few moments here. First, I'd like to ask your help. I'd like to have your help in order to grow our podcast more, in order to share the gospel to more people, but also to encourage the church to share their faith and to be able to be equipped with the right answers for some of those difficult questions. So I'd like to invite you to go to iTunes and look for our podcast there. There will be a link in the description to our iTunes page. And I encourage you to write us and give us comments about our podcast. Also, we'd like to answer your questions. So if you have a question or a comment, we invite you to do so by going to our contact page on our website. There'll also be a link to that in the description for this episode. We invite you to do that because we love to interact with our listeners. Also, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast either through iTunes or through your favorite podcast app. And through that, you'll be able to be sure that you get every new episode that comes up right away. One other way you can help us out is by handing off to your pastor a media kit about our podcast. You can download that for free at steppingoutministries.com/podcast. We certainly would appreciate your help in that. Today, as we mentioned on the program, we're talking about the Bible and mythology. And before we actually look at some of the claims of the Bible being mythology, there's something important we need to do first, and that is to understand truth and the value of truth. What makes something truthful? I'd like to share with you 8 points about truth in order to understand that something is true or quite possibly could be true. So the first point is truth is a matter of something being right. That means it's something that is correct, that there's no error to it. For example, if I were to say that I'm going to hold a pen in my hand and when I drop it, it's going to fall. We know based on scientific law that that's what's going to happen. So that is true. It's going to fall unless there's some other force that's going to stop it from falling. Truth is a matter of something being right or correct. The second point is truth exists even if the truth is unknown. It reminds me of the old question of, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound still, if no one's there to hear it? Well, the truth is, we know that if the tree falls, it makes a sound. So we could deduce that if no one's there to hear it, it's still going to make the sound. So the truth exists, even if the truth is unknown. Number 3, truth does not require evidence, but evidence makes the truth believable. The reason for that being, again, with the example of the tree falling in the forest, truth doesn't require the evidence that it made the sound, but evidence makes that more believable. Something is always true because it is true. But then when we have the evidence, we discover that truth. So truth does not require evidence, but we believe it because of the evidence for it. Point 4 is believability does not necessitate lack of truth. This relates back to the last point. Just because something isn't believable doesn't mean that it's not true. The same thing is true about God. For some, they don't believe that God is true because we don't have scientific evidence, supposedly, that God exists. So someone doesn't believe it because they don't think there's sufficient evidence for it. But that doesn't mean that it's any less true. Fifthly, when there are similarities with myth, one must consider the similarities to have some measure of truth. We'll use an example of this with Noah's flood in a few moments here. When we look at stories, when stories are compared, some will say, well, it can't be true because there's these other stories that aren't true. The thing is, we must consider that there may be something true within that story. And if there's many different stories, but there's some certain details that are the same through all of them, we could take those and consider them to be truth. The 6th point to truth value is that the age of a document does not determine its truth value. You'll hear some people talk about how the Bible is ancient, that it's outdated. But that doesn't mean that there's not truth in the Bible. The age of the document doesn't determine whether it's truthful or not. So when someone uses that argument that, well, it can't be true because it's so old, it's outdated, it's archaic, that's not a good argument. You have to look at the evidence of what is said, first of all, in the book to see if it is true or not. Seventh point of truth value is science is not the only way to determine truth. Just because something is contrary to what scientists say does not make something untrue. Likewise, the lack of science does not determine the value of truth. The thing we have to remember is that scientists are human beings and they are fallible. There are scientific theories that are put out all the time or hypotheses that end up being wrong because they had the wrong idea. So just because a scientist says this is true doesn't mean we have to accept it. It's again a matter of the evidence for that to be true or not. So science does not determine truth. We use other things that indicate truth or not, such as reason. Even science has to be in line with reason. It has to make sense still. Now, something making sense doesn't mean that it's based on our ability to perceive or understand, but reasoning is used to determine whether something is true or not, whether it makes sense or whether it contradicts or not, whether it's a paradox or a contradiction. So science is not the only way to determine truth. There are other ways to determine truth. The last point I'd like to share with you on truth value is that when there is truth contained in a source, one must consider the unbelievable to be truth. In other words, must consider it to be factual history. When there are situations recorded in history, it doesn't mean that it's not true because it seems far-fetched. We hear the phrase, it's stranger than fiction. And oftentimes those things that are stranger than fiction turn out to be true. Again, it's a matter of testing to see if that situation or that story is true or not. But the bizarreness of it does not mean that it's not true. Next, we'll take a look at the mythological claims of the Bible right after these words.
I just heard this funny joke. It's a great joke.
Are you living your life to please God?
You won't believe how funny this is. No, I really shouldn't tell this kind of joke. But it's so funny. No, I can't tell you.
Or are you living to please others?
Okay. Pretend it's not me telling the joke, okay? You're going to love this.
Is your love for God only worth a joke? Another message from Lifeline Productions, located on the web at lifelinepro.com.
We've looked at what truth value is, but now we need to apply that to some of the claims that are lodged against the Bible, specifically that the Bible is mythology. Probably one of the biggest stories that is mentioned as being myth is Noah and the flood, as we see in the book of Genesis. There are some who will use the argument in saying that, well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is very similar to it, and we know that that's fiction, so the story of Noah and the flood can't be true. It's not true then. People have also mentioned about the Sumerian poem detailing the creation of the universe that predates the writings of Genesis. That too contains a flood story whose plot points are almost identical to the story of Noah. So what do we do with this claim that the Bible's myth because of the story of Noah? Well, we can look at it and say, okay, well, if there's the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh and there's other stories like it, let's take a look at what's the similarities then. The similarities between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah and the flood is that there is a flood. So we could take that and say, okay, even though this Epic of Gilgamesh is fiction, there's a similarity because of the people who told it, that used it to tell a story of something that happened in the past. So there should be some traction then that the flood recorded in Genesis happened. Next to that then is the Sumerian poem detailing the creation of the universe. And it's interesting that it details the flood very closely to the narrative in Genesis. So because it's so close, we can say, hey, you know what? These two are very, very close. There's some very close similarities. And so therefore, we must consider this to have been an actual event. Again, just because it's poetry doesn't mean it's not true. Oftentimes, when poetry is written, there's truth within it. The next story that's used as an example to support the claim that the Bible is mythology is the story that the day the sun stood still. The story is when Joshua and the Israelites are out in battle, and it's getting late in the day. And they need the sunlight still in order to finish this battle. And so Joshua prays and asks the Lord to stop the sun from moving so they'd have daylight longer to wipe out the nation they're fighting. And so God did. God had the sun stand still. Some people will say, well, this is mythology because it's impossible for the sun to stand still, especially because it's not the sun moving, because it's the earth moving around the sun and the earth rotating. And if the earth were to all of a sudden to stop, it would throw gravity out of whack and centrifugal force, and there'd be chaos all over the planet. The thing they forget is that God is all-powerful, and that God could perform a miracle. That means God doesn't suspend things. What he does is he intervenes in things. And so a miracle like the sun standing still, or the earth maybe in this case, can happen because God has the power and the authority to do so. So that's an argument we can say that, no, that doesn't hold that the Bible is mythology. Even though it's a story that seems far-fetched, there's a possibility of truth in that. The next two claims relate to each other. The talking donkey and the talking snake. People say, well, it's not possible. Snakes can't talk and donkeys can't talk. God can use anything to talk to someone with. Yes, God can use a donkey. In the story of Balaam, when he was wanting to go and curse the Israelites, God stopped him by using his donkey. His donkey had swerved away from an angel with a sword who was about to run him through, but the donkey stopped, and then Balaam started to beat his donkey, and his donkey talked to him and said, "Stop, why are you beating me?" And they have this little exchange, and then finally Balaam's eyes are open and sees the angel there, and the Lord speaks to him and tells him not to say anything or do anything other than what he tells him to do. Is it possible for God to talk through a donkey? Seems far-fetched, but yet, even though these are stranger than fiction, there is truth to these two stories. Again, if God can create the whole universe out of nothing, and not even do anything physically other than speak it into existence, God certainly can talk through a donkey. The next story that's used as a mythological claim to the Bible is the story of Israel crossing the Red Sea. Some even denounce and say that, well, Israel never lived in Egypt. But there is historical and archaeological evidence that that is true, that Israel did live in Egypt for a time period. There's also the evidence that Israel did cross the Red Sea. Now it seems strange. How is it possible for the Red Sea to part waves and for the ground to be dry for the Israelites to walk across? It seems like a far-fetched story. But again, God is all-powerful. So God can intervene in the natural and can cause the waters to part like walls. This story of Israel, even though it seems far-fetched, is a true story. The Israelites have told it for generations and generations. So this, too, does not work as a mythological claim. The next is the account of giants. The Bible talks about some giants, the Nephilim, for example, being in existence for a period of time. There have been archaeological digs that have found skeletons of giants. So archaeology has shown this to be true, that there have been giant people. The next one is probably one of the bigger arguments too, to the claim that the Bible is mythology, and that is the creation account. Oftentimes people will say, well, there's two creation accounts, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They're two different creation accounts. But they're not. If you actually study them, you'll see that it's one creation account. You actually see in Genesis 1, verse 1 and 2, it's kind of like the prologue to the whole creation account. Then the rest of Genesis 1 into the beginning of Genesis 2 is the 6-day account of God creating the universe and all of life. Then in chapter 2, it's giving some more of those details to each of those creations that God had made. It all actually has order, and it makes sense. It may be hard for some to understand, well, how's it possible for there to be light with no sun? But don't we forget that God is light? As we look at our world and our universe, even through the laws of thermodynamics, we see that there had to be a beginning to all of this, and that some outside force had to create the universe. We as Christians believe that that is God, and that he's all-powerful. That's why he's able to speak creation into existence. Even in Genesis, being a 6-day account of creation, and on the 7th day God resting. And of each day in Genesis it says, and there was evening and day the first day. And it goes right into the story of Adam and Eve, connected right to day 6 of creation. So we see, even from science, that there had to be a beginning. There had to be some outside force that created everything out of nothing. As one of the laws of thermodynamics says, that there's only enough energy in the universe that already existed from the beginning. There can only be a change in different forms, like from natural form to energy, and vice versa. Now there's some who say that, well, the speed of light, though, that is also an argument against the creation account, because we know that this star is so far away and that it takes this long for the light to get here. But there's several problems with that argument too. The problem is we truly don't know the speed of light in space. It may be slower, it may be faster. Not only that, we don't know the distance from stars to us. It's an estimate, a guess, because we don't have a giant cosmic ruler to be able to measure physically from Earth to those other stars. So science, those who are scientists who say these things, they are wrong in the determination. And it is not evidence against the creation account. Again, God is all-powerful, and he was able to speak the universe and all life into existence. Here's one argument that's important for us to use to speak against the claim that the Bible is mythology, and that is the Bible does contain history. People have said to me that the Bible can't be true. So I asked them, okay, so Egypt didn't exist then? Or Israel didn't exist? How about the Babylonians and Canaan? We see evidence of them through archaeology, so how is the Bible not true then when the Bible mentions those places and events? Some use the argument, though, but the Egyptian timeline doesn't match with that of the Bible. Well, there's been some studies done actually looking at texts from other nations, and all of those texts agree with the biblical text of the timeline. It's actually Egypt's timeline that seems to be out of whack. You have to consider that when there's one timeline not the same as many others, that one quite possibly could be wrong. And in this case, Egypt's timeline is incorrect as to when the Israelites were in Egypt and when they left. So it is important to know history because the Bible contains history, and paying attention to when we hear more archaeological discoveries of the trueness of the Bible. One such discovery was that of the uncovering of Jericho. The Bible talks about how the walls of Jericho fell, and the walls have been found to be laying in the way that the Bible describes. The Bible also talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. One person had done an archaeological dig along the Dead Sea and found these little balls of sulfur, which fits in line with what the Bible said about fire and brimstone and sulfur raining down from heaven upon those wicked cities. So we see, as we look at each of these mythological claims, that the Bible isn't mythology, that the Bible is true. So again, it's considering who God is and how powerful he is. It's also considering that maybe the scientists are wrong in some of what they think. They certainly don't have solid evidence for some of those claims against the Bible. And it's also looking at the thread of truth, the similarities in the stories, even with mythology, because there may be truth in those stories as it lines up with the Bible. When someone uses the excuse that the Bible's mythology and so must not be true, we can know and share with them the truth that the Bible is true, that is not mythology. There's history in the Bible. There's details that are true. And because the Bible is God's Word and God is truth, we can believe it and accept it. I'd like to say that we don't use the science to prove the Bible or prove that God exists. Rather, it's God and the Scriptures that prove science. So when a scientist says something that's not correct with God's Word, we need to go back to what God's Word says and use that with a lens to look at the information and then to determine whether what science is saying is true or not. Again, we don't deny science. After all, God is the one who created science. And we must remember that the term science means knowledge. It's what we know. So there are certain things that we do know about the natural world, and there's some things that we don't know yet. And God will reveal those to us in time. The main thing to remember is that the Bible is not myth, because God has spoken it to us, to know him, to know how powerful he is, and to know how much he loves us. I want to thank you for joining us today. And I trust this episode has been helpful for you to answering the claim that the Bible is mythology. Next time on the program, we'll be answering the question, what about those who have never heard the gospel? Will they get to heaven? Until then, this is Pastor Kevin reminding you to preach the gospel to any person, anywhere, anytime, no matter the cost.
You have been listening to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries. To submit a comment or question for Pastor Kevin to answer on the podcast, visit us at www.steppingoutministries.com. Thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us for our next podcast.